Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Performing Resistance Dialogues on Arts, Migration, Inclusive Cities. This is an international summer school, which is part of the international project Atlas of Transition Biennale. This is a series of online talks, lectures, dialogues, and the streams will be available for a few days on social networks. Each talk lasts 1 hour, about, and we will dialogue with our first guest for 40 minutes, and then we will open to your comments and questions. So please be active part of it. Write your question, and we will try to collect them and respond as many as possible. Let me introduce Marco Martinello. He is a research director at the Belgian National Fund for Scientific Research, and he teaches sociology of migration and ethnicity at the University of Liège, Belgium, where he is the director of the Center for Ethnic and Migration Studies and director for the Institute of Social Science Research. He was a visiting scholar in different universities all around the world. The title of our dialogue is Performing Arts and the Slow Emergence of a Post-Racial Generation in Urban Europe. I would like to start our conversation by recognizing the relevance of racism in Europe too. For example, according to the last Fundamental Rights report published by the European Union for Fundamental Rights, ethnic minorities and migrants continue to face harassment and discrimination across Europe. Regarding everyday racism, 1 out of 3 Black people experience racial harassment, and 4 out of 10 say that nothing would have changed by reporting it. Moreover, racist violence is common in Europe, but remains largely invisibilized. Discriminatory racial profiling remains a concern. 4 out of 10 Black people stopped by police say it was because of their skin color. And finally, Islamophobia and xenoracism, racism against migrants and refugees, have become mainstream across Europe, not to mention European necropolitics of migration. And anti-Gypsyism across Europe remains a persistent barrier to improving the social and economic situation of Roma. So my first question for Marco Martiniello is, what about your view on heavily racialized and polarized contemporary Europe, especially in times of pandemic?
Well, first, good afternoon, Annalisa. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. I would have preferred to be physically in Italy, but such is life. So I will take a few minutes to develop, what I think about what is going on. And I think we need to go back to history. I think it's important. Many people are tempted to forget history, and I think it's very important to remember. And I would like to start by saying that, in my view, most Western countries, or the West at large, if you prefer, has developed 3 types of connected systems of domination, exploitation, and oppression. The first one is based on gender. There's a lot to be said about patriarchal societies and, the consequence it still has today. The second system is based on social class, or more broadly on social economic dimensions. And the third one is based on ethnicity, race, religion, and sometimes more broadly on cultural dimensions. And so I claim, and this is my first claim, which is not very original, but it's important to remember it, is that racism is part of the Western culture, at least since the 15th century, and some people say that it started even much longer before that. So racism is part of Western culture. And these 3 systems of domination, exploitation, and oppression are connected and they intersect in many different ways. The second point is that, it's the term racism is used in many different ways, and there's no consensus about the definition of racism. And sometimes this explains the misunderstandings between various people and groups using the same word but with different definitions. I would like to make a distinction between four dimensions of racism. The first one is the ideological definition of racism, which basically is an ideology of homogenization and inferiorization based on the separation of humankind in distinct races, that is, groups that would be characterized by historically their biological characteristics and more recently their cultural characteristics. And basically the West has invented an inferior black race, and sometimes blacks were not even considered as human beings. We will discuss maybe later about slavery and so on. And of course, in mirror, the white race was constructed as superior. That's all the ideas of white supremacy that you find in slavery, in colonialism, in apartheid. And this is, a kind of very solid ideological construction that I claim is very important even today, after what happened in the Second World War, unfortunately. The second dimension of racism refers to prejudice, or a set of prejudices that we develop with concerning the other groups that are defined as races. And there are all sorts of prejudices that can be either positive or negative. So we tend to when we meet someone that is supposed to belong to another group, we come in that interaction with all sorts of prejudices. White people cannot dance, black people run faster, whatever. You can, go back to all sorts of prejudices that are there. So that's another dimension of racism. The third dimension of racism refers to acts, hate speech, violence, that have marked the history in very serious and unacceptable ways, but that you can still find today, of course, in daily life. The fourth dimension, which is very controversial in the policy and political debates, but which is for us scholars, which is, which we can objectify in many different ways, is what we call institutional and structural racism, or systemic racism even. Actually, it refers to all the discriminations, direct but also indirect, that affect, for example, people with an African background in European countries, discrimination in all the fields of society, the labor market, the education and cultural domain, health, politics, the relations with the judiciary and with the police and things like that. So you have all these institutional discrimination that are at work on the premises of certain people belonging to a certain racial group. And I would say that the step further, the 4+ dimension, is what I call complete political racism, which is also inscribed in laws. It's when a system, a juridical system, a government defines racist laws that basically force people to stay at a certain level in society. Well, we had all these laws in apartheid, we had all these laws in Jim Crow, and basically all the society is totally organized on the inequality between racial groups. So what is the issue now in contemporary Europe during the pandemics? I claim that the racist ideology is still there, and it's defended by many nationalist parties, by far right parties, by extreme right parties, and it's also diffused in society. And some people unconsciously are, have been socialized through that racist ideology, even sometimes when they are not aware of it. But also, there is a kind of return of old style racialism, biological racism, that's happening in Europe. A few years ago, I was reading an article by a very famous British psychologist in a very mainstream journal published by the Elsevier, which is one of the most important academic publishing company. And the argument was very clear. He was trying to explain why the south of Italy has never developed and will never develop. So there are all sorts of materialist explanation you could give, but he was coming up with a genetic explanation. His point was that the south of Italy will never develop because genetically the southern Italians are closer to the Africans. So this is a good example of a return of 19th century biological racism, and this in a mainstream social science journal. So we have to be very worried about that. Second, prejudices in the COVID era. Well, I don't know, you are coming from many different countries, but in many countries, as soon as we get aware of the gravity of the situation in China, prejudice against the Chinese started to be expressed again in everywhere. In the city where I live, in Brussels, many people decided to cancel their booking in Chinese restaurants, for example. There were, people, Asian-looking people were insulted in the street without, of course, any relation to the nationality, and were asked to go back home because all the prejudices about, the lack of hygiene, all the prejudices against Asian that some people have came up to the front again in a very, very difficult period. It's always, when you have nothing else, it functions when you use scapegoating and you blame the other. It's very useful, especially when it's pushed forward by some politicians to resort to that type of old prejudices in order to exclude or to explain the problems that you can face. So there were acts, the third dimension. Racist acts developed in everyday life, and we see there in the streets. I have many articles about what happened during this period. Chinese-looking people being beaten up at the bus stop for no reason, just because they were Chinese or they looked Chinese. They were not even Chinese for many of them. So this happens very much, without mentioning, in a field that I know well and that I like, the field of football. And Italy is a good example of the daily before COVID started, and there were still people in the stadium, African players or Italian with African descent players were shouted at, monkey songs and things like that. This is, it's very, very well, very alive in Europe, in many sectors of society. And then there is the fourth, discrimination, institutional racism, structural racism. Well, discrimination is at work. As I was saying before, there are direct and indirect discriminations. The way the institution works advantage some groups, disadvantage other groups. And in the question of the period of COVID, for example, it is clear that amongst the people who were most exposed to the virus, there were many people coming from ethnicized and racialized minorities because they were working in the positions at the low level of the salary scale, to take care of the elderly, to drive the metro and the buses, to work in food stalls and so on. These people were more exposed to the virus than, I would say, people like Annalisa and me, who had the luxury to work at home, without being exposed basically to anything. And so this is, in my view, also a very strong, severe form of discrimination. I would like also to mention the way the policing of the lockdown took place in different countries also reflects all this discrimination. It's clear that the police does not behave in the same way in neighborhoods where there is a high proportion of migrants or ethnic and racialized minorities, or in very posh neighborhoods that happen to be, in most cases, at least in Europe, white neighborhoods as well. So in the city of Brussels, during the 3 months, there were, many problems between the youngsters with migrant origin background and the police, and a young guy of 17 years old called Adil was killed during a police intervention in Brussels. Nobody reacted because Adil is a young Moroccan in a neighborhood called Anderlecht, and he's not in the US. And so it's probably a little less sexy, but Adil was also, there's no reason why he had to die. He did nothing. He was just trying to have some fresh air, which is something you want to do when you live in a small apartment with a family and you don't have a garden and you have to be, in your apartment for forever. So this is another example, and there are many examples in different countries about that. But I would say, and this is the 5 dimension of racism, in my view, in most European countries, there is no complete political racism. I would say that there is no government. Maybe we can talk about Hungary, in which racism is enshrined into the laws, and where the legislation, the government, everybody, legalizes in a very harsh sense racism and discrimination. So, fortunately, I would say that in most European countries, we are still not there. But we have to do everything not to get there, and also to work on the other 4 dimensions of racism. So for me, the situation is very serious. It has been reinforced by the COVID crisis, but it was pre-existing before, of course.
Thank you very much. And in difficult times of polarization and fragmentation, reading your articles and books, you see hope, especially in urban youth, whatever their origin, skin color, gender, sexual orientation, class, or religion, come together around artistic projects. So can you tell us some empirical examples, please?
Yeah. So the urban youth is not a category that should be homogenized and essentialized. We have studies to show that, for example, many youngsters support extreme right-wing and nationalist parties. This is the case in Italy, this is the case in Belgium, in France, in Hungary, I was mentioning before. So you have definitely a part of the youth that basically reproduces what the previous generations were doing. But you also have another part of the urban youth, which actually was born and educated in diversity. So, which they they are super diverse, even though, as I said before, we live in a context heavily marked by racism. But still, they tend to be used to diversity. For them, it's not a problem to share something with someone, whatever the skin color, the social background, the sexual orientation. Basically, that youth uh, is more united by an artistic project. And so I've done some work on hip hop and yeah, what we could call street dance. You know, all the dance styles that emerged from the hip hop movement. Well, you have on the one hand, you have crews that are totally monoracial or monoethnic, but you also have uh, another part of the youth that you see all these crews that are completely diverse, different origins, different sexual orientation, different social and economic background, and all these groups, they perform together. They are united by that. And the same in theater. Theater is also theater, and I would say, and stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedians sometimes, they appeal to that diverse urban generation that basically uh, challenges uh, the established racial, ethnic, gender, and also social class order they have been born to. So for me, music, dance, theater, stand-up probably are the better examples. Let me just make two concrete examples. Some of you know probably World of Dance. World of Dance is one of the major urban dance corporation based in Los Angeles. They make an awful lot of money by organizing these dance competition everywhere in the world. And well, I went to make some observation in the Belgian chapter of World of Dance, and basically many of the crews were exactly that. They were these very diverse group of youngsters doing their thing all together. The same with another dance competition called Choreographers Ball, same observation. So there are these examples that are sort of, it should not happen, if you want, in this heavily polarized society, but it's there. So I'm not saying the majority, but I think we have to explain how that works, why does it happen, and maybe if we want to look at social change, to look at that as kind of, hope for the future. Apparently, there are some questions, but we continue or we do the questions later, as you prefer, Annalisa.
Maybe we can leave the question later.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to ask you something about the term post-racial, because I was wondering if speaking about post-racial generation can be tricky, because racism, as you said, is always still there. Maybe I would prefer to speak about the rising of a new anti-racist generation, where the question of consciousness become crucial, especially for white youth who open their eyes on their privilege, and for the cultural challenge again, white innocence, using Gloria Wekker concept. So the question of consciousness in order to recognize the legacy of European colonial past. Anyway, I agree with you on the relevance of everyday life for urban youth in super diverse cities, and on the potential of arts to resist the multiple discrimination based on class, race, gender, and more or less consciously. Thus, a post-racial or anti-racist generation. And what about the role of consciousness among these urban youth? In which conditions they become an anti-racist generation?
It's a very interesting question. Well, what I'm not saying is two things. I'm not saying that we live in a post-racial era. That was a motto for the first Obama campaign. That was a kind of political communication device, that we are, because of because of him, we would have entered a society in which race, gender, whatever, do not matter anymore. A kind of maybe dream society. I would like to live in a society like that, but as we've said before, unfortunately, we are not in a post-racial era. Second thing I do not say that young urban generation is colorblind. They know very well that there is racism, sexism, domination based on class. They know that. And so that's very important. So in my view, that generation is post-racial. Why? And it can be both post-racial and anti-racist. But I think there is a difference between the two. It is post-racial because in their everyday life, in their lifestyle, they challenge the traditional forms of categorization based on race, on gender, on social class. They are united, as I said before, by the artistic project that define their worldview in a way. And in that sense, for them, they know exactly that, I made interviews with some of these young artists, and what was very difficult for them, for example, is that, I started, well, I'm interested in cultural diversity and things like that. And they were saying, what exactly do you want? I mean, what's the problem? I mean, that this is the crew. It's not a matter of culture, of race, etc. We know that we come from different backgrounds, but this is what we are. For us, the traditional categories in our group, in our daily interactions, these forms of categorization are not important. But as soon as we go out of our group, of course they are important, because if there is a police control, it's always the Arab artists or the black artists that are controlled, and not the white young ladies, for example, in the band. So that's why, in my view, they are post-racial. It's because they don't give the same importance to the traditional forms of categorization, and especially racial categorization, in their daily interactions. And so the fact, even if they do nothing, I mean, even if they do not mobilize or participate in demonstration and so on, the mere fact that they live their life that way is seen as a challenge, especially by people who advocate a more homogeneous racial and ethnic order. Here in Belgium, the people who react the most to that are, of course, the extreme nationalist right-wing political parties that want to cut the subsidies to these forms of art because they do not, veiculate the image of the Flemish culture they have in mind, for example. But these groups also mobilize, and then they can be openly and truly anti-racist. Well, I've been really amazed by what's going on in the demonstrations after the assassination of George Floyd in the US and in Europe. Everywhere, the demonstration gathered a very diverse crowd, diverse in terms of skin color, ethnic background, with many whites. I have reports from some demonstrations in some cities in the US where there were even more white demonstrators than black demonstrators. In the city of Rochester, New York, for example, because in Europe we always focus on the same cities, and this is also very interesting, these demonstrations happen in many, many cities of all sizes, and also in cities who do not have an history of mobilization against racism. Very interesting. Different social backgrounds, different sexual orientation. So basically, this is that post-racial generation maybe becoming explicitly anti-racist. There are talks about a transracial coalition, and we'll see how this movement is going to develop. But it's also very interesting to note that they use very much music. Well, more in the U.S. Than in Europe, where in the U.S. The demonstration in each city featured different musical styles. In Detroit, it was more techno because it's the heaven of techno. In Washington, it was go-go music, so the local form of funk. In LA, the Latino punk scene was very active. And in New York, of course, you find everything from rap, New Orleans music, because, they were climatic refugees from the Katrina hurricane and so on. So this is, in my view, quite interesting to note. Now, coming to the notion of privilege and awareness and things like that, there it's a difficult debate. And I think it has to be connected to the three systems of domination I was talking about earlier. Personally, and I know it's controversial, but I prefer the word benefit to the word privilege. Because privilege is, for me, it's too much ancien régime, French ancien régime. It raises images of aristocracy and things like that. And so for me, it's, I know it's fashionable, but I'm not sure I want to buy it. I prefer to talk about bias, to talk about benefits. And I think that if we refer to the three systems of domination, we should talk about white benefits, we should talk also about upper class benefits, and we should talk also about male benefits. And so if we want to develop an intersectional approach and perspective, that's what we should do. And I think it's important also to talk about the privilege of the black ruling class in the ex-colonies, for example, in terms of privilege. Why don't we talk about that? And why do we consider that poor working class workers in Europe are expressing a white privilege? My family comes from a very poor migrant background. My father was sort of deported to Belgium to work in the coal mines. Two members of my family died because of the sickness of working in the coal mine. Let me tell you that it was a bit difficult to explain to my father that he was privileged because he was white. And that, so we have to be a bit, we have to play the card of intersectionality all the way. Intersectionality means looking at how the three systems of domination interact and produce different sorts of benefits and biases. And I think that playing on the sense of guilt of young whites, like some activists do today, I think it's intellectually dishonest and politically counterproductive. You cannot blame young whites today for colonialism and slavery, just as you cannot blame young Germans today for the Holocaust. But what you can do, and maybe it is what's happening today, is that you can, and this was a slogan I saw last week in the demonstration against racism in Brussels, 20,000 people in Brussels in a period of lockdown. And one of the slogans that was presented by young African Belgian activist was, and I like that, it's not white, it's not black against white, it's black and white against racism. And that's, I find myself very comfortable in that perspective. And well, I know this is very controversial. I'm very used to it, but I think I'm happy to discuss about that.
Okay, so let's leave some space for discussing afterwards. Maybe my last question concerns alliances and longer-term struggles. Starting from the last demonstration affirming that Black Lives Matter still in Europe, anti-racist struggles seems more and more translocal and transnational. In which ways arts can make easier alliances across borders? And which forms of contemporary arts seem to support better the work of anti-racist youth in European cities? Can you add something on this issue you just mentioned?
I would like to add, yes, there is a problem of building and consolidated alliances to struggle against the three systems of domination I was mentioning earlier. If we stick to the racial domination and exploitation system, well, there are three levels of alliances that need to be built and consolidated. First, it's between blacks. Here in Brussels, they were, in the preparation of the big demonstration, there were quite severe conflicts between the Congolese and the other sub-Sahara Africans. You know, Congo was a colony of the first of King Leopold II, and then from Belgium. And so actually, there's a kind of strange relationship between Belgium and Congo. And in the preparation of the demonstration, many people from originating in other African countries, like, for example, Guinea or Mali or Senegal and so on, said, well, we have no say. It's always the Congolese that take the lead. Why should it be so? I mean, why shouldn't we be involved also in the leadership of the movement? Second element is the alliances between blacks and other ethnicized groups. Again, in the preparation of the demonstration, some of the Congolese activists didn't want to give the floor to the parent of a young Belgian Moroccan who was killed by the police because he was not black, because he was not really a true victim of racism, because he was from Moroccan origin. And so eventually they found a solution to allow everybody to find a place in that struggle, in a kind of convergence of interest in the struggle. And then, of course, there's the question of the white, where actually some people said, well, 2 years ago, the most, I would say, angry fringe of the black movement in Belgium said, well, no, as a white person, you don't even have the right to speak about racism, let alone participate in a demonstration. That is the ultimate proof of paternalism. We don't need your help. We will do it on our own. Now things have changed. The idea is more to build and consolidate these transnational, trans-ethnic, trans-racial alliances. There is also a kind of fascination with the US. What I said about Europe, I believe it deeply, but I also believe that the race issue is different in the US and in Europe. And so we have to basically, it would be too simplistic to import an American anti-racism in Europe, just we imported anything from the US. There is this fascination that we know in the social sciences, where we've spent some of our time in trying to find the concept and theories in the US and then adapt them to Europe. I think we are able to also develop our own reflection, and we are able also maybe to develop our own anti-racist struggles. So in that context, what type of arts? I'm not naive. I think that art can really unite people, but I also think that arts can divide people. And if you look at the art world, there's a lot of discrimination in the art world as well, and which is sometimes difficult to talk about that, because there is this idea that by nature art would be open to diversity, etc. But in reality, there's also discrimination in the art world. So, and I would say there's also, yes, racial discrimination in the artistic world. In terms of artistic disciplines, I think that, again, music and dance are important, theater and stand-up. There is the place of slam, which is quite interesting, in order to articulate claims sometimes in a very sophisticated way, I think. And at least here in France, in many places, it's really, there's something going on. The scene is really spreading, and it allows for exchanges between different artists from different parts of the world. And also street art, I think, is something that can talk to many people in that anti-racist struggle. But also, and I don't know if it's a white privilege, it's probably a privilege of age. I'm old enough to remember the first anti-racist movement from the 1980s in France. And here there's something the new anti-racist movements should avoid, is political manipulation and political cooptation. In the sense that the first anti-racist movement in France was sort of recuperated by the Socialist Party, and some of the leaders of the movement were co-opted in the system, given a nice seat, and their action was sort of depoliticized. I think we have to avoid that today. And maybe by being active in the art, there is a way to preserve some autonomy. The big question is now, what's going to happen with the arts, and especially the performing arts, in the post-COVID era? And here I only have question marks, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. So let's see the question now. And we can start reading. So maybe we start from the first Mario Abebe question. What do you think the legacy of Cody on racism? And then Pierluigi Musarò, since COVID explicited in a clearer way social inequalities and different forms of racism, do you think it will be also an opportunity to reflect and act against it in a more collective and participated way?
I think the two questions are in a way connected.
Yep.
I do hope that if something comes out of this crisis, is that we have realized that we all live on Earth. Then, even though there are discrimination that explain that some people are more subjected to be sick and so on, as I said before, but we are facing a global thing, and that basically I've seen also movements of solidarity between people that developed. And maybe if there is something I could hope, is that we realize that the earth does not belong to us, but we belong, all of us, to the earth. And so if we treat the earth a bit better, maybe we wouldn't have that type of problem that basically was caused by humans, and basically by humans that have the power in this world. So also, I still dream of, I think every day, frankly, about that, and how in this situation, how can people still believe in racist ideology? How do people can still say that discrimination does not exist? I don't understand why, especially in this situation that shows that, deeply, the deep common things that should connect all of us human beings. How do people are still stuck with those ideas? I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but if I want to be optimistic, I would say that maybe when there is a very serious and deep crisis, there is hope to invent something else. There's been a lot of discussion about, the world after and things like that. What I see, unfortunately, is that, for example, the corporate world tends to react exactly in the same way as before the COVID. So I would like to be very optimistic, but I think nothing will be given, and getting rid of racism will take enduring transnational mobilization, and not just, like what's going on today, where suddenly also you have people who discover that they are anti-racist. And I'm a bit afraid that the Black Lives Matter will be turned into a kind of gimmick, a commercial gimmick, to avoid changing really the deep structures of society. So that's another thing we should, sometimes I don't believe when the leader of the Liberal Party in Belgium says that he puts a picture of Martin Luther King in front of the building, and that party has played a major role in passing anti-immigration legislation and things like that. So I'm a bit skeptical when people change their mind that quickly. All sorts of contradictions here.
Thank you. So let's speak again about politics. So Jonathan Nicoletti from Brazil asked, what is it's difficult to breathe today in Brazil. What is the similarity between what currently happens in Brazil and in European countries? Is it a wave? When will it pass?
Yeah, Brazil is. I'm not a specialist in Brazil, but I just know that the Brazilian president, is part of these presidents who seem to live on another planet, like Trump, for example. And I think that Brazil is a very interesting case because for a long time, and Jonathan will correct me, the issue of racism was not an issue in Brazil because there was this myth of the multiracial democracy, and that everybody bought in Europe. Many people in Europe thought that, well, look at Brazil, their national football team, this reflects the multiracial democracy in Brazil. And then when you were talking with critical Brazilian social scientists, you would discover that they had another perspective about the permanence of racism in Brazilian society. And I think that the way the president is managing the crisis also reflects the extent of racism in Brazilian society. The history of, a difference with Europe is that in some European countries, at least, it was easier not to see it for the majority of the population. If you take Belgium, because it was happening in the colonies, at thousands of miles away, and many people. It was before, online exchange of information. People would know very little about what was going on in the colonies. Many people really thought that Belgium was there to civilize Africans. And some people, unfortunately, still think that today. But now there's no excuse because they should know. Whereas in Brazil, I mean, the legacy of slavery, I would believe, but Jonathan will probably correct me, is there. And racial discrimination seems to me is very vivid there too. And I'm very empathic and I suffer with Brazilian people. I don't think that individuals can change history, but I think that it would be nice to get rid of that type of leader we have. And there's a competition between which one is the most stupid, and I don't know who is going to win, Bolsonaro or Trump. They are very good competitors in terms of stupidity and meanness as well.
Thank you. Another question. Melissa asks, first, she states, as Muffel suggests, artistic practices are capable of subverting dominant hegemonic perspectives through an agonistic approach, which considers the difference instead of evening them out, becoming a space of resistance and participation. In your research experience, did it happen that artistic practices led to some sorts of cultural conflicts? And how is it possible to find a solution avoiding cultural simplification or the prevailing of a particular vision?
Mm-hmm. Very interesting question. Of course, it would also need very long developments. But the first thing I'm thinking of is, and I know that I see there's also a participant from Belgium, is a performance that was produced by the Flemish theater in Brussels, the KVS, which is the most renowned theater in Brussels. A few years ago, they produced a show called Malcolm X, and the idea was to think about what would Malcolm X do and say if he was alive today, for example, in Brussels or in another European multicultural and diverse city. And the play, it was theater, music, dance, multidisciplinary production, mainly with artists with an African background, but living in Europe, in the UK, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and so on. It started very, very violently. The first 10 minutes, you have one actor that insults very heavily the white audience. And this is, I was there, I went a few times to observe how people were reacting. And to be frank, the first time, it took me a few minutes to understand that it was part of the play. Okay, I thought that that was real, which also led me to think, why do I think that it could have been not included in the play? It's a parenthesis. But that play really changed very much, challenged the spectators, forced them to think about why they were there, why they were happy or angry about what was going on stage. It's really forced people to get out of their zone of comfort. And I think that arts can do that much more than our sociological work, Annalisa, for example.
I know.
And so for me, it was a good example that, you can shake the tree very interestingly with arts. It's more difficult to do it with our sociological investigation, unless if we work with artists, which always is a possibility as well.
Yes. we like to cooperate with artists.
Yeah.
Another question. Bakare Babatunde, Allen. I thank the speaker for his detailed insights. However, I would like to ask him what efforts have been put in place to reorientate the African folks who are immigrants and refugees all over Europe artistically. The reason for this question is that many of my African folks are mostly damaged psychologically because of bad governance, courtesy of many bad African leaders. The social, political, and economic hardship are over time affected Africans. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting as well. Well, there are many projects that have been developed in many European countries. Actually, I published a collection of essays on arts and refugees that illustrate some. And I think Annalisa, you're in it, right? Yes, of course. So Annalisa has an article in it, and yeah, projects are being developed in different countries, but sometimes it's and many times it's probably not enough, also because we cannot put too much pressure and too much hope on arts either, because people also need to have a place in society, need to reconstruct their life, to find a job, to find a place to stay, to find a school for the kids and so on. And sometimes it's a kind of either or. I've met different, in our interviews, I've met many refugee artists who was saying, well, I cannot do my art anymore here. First, because people see me as a refugee, as not as an artist. And second, because I have to work 12 hours a day without contract sometimes in order to feed the family. So that's really a problem. Also, because there is discrimination, as I said before, in the artistic world. I was struck by this other musician from Iraq, well, not from Africa, but from Iraq, who was a very known musician in Iraq, and he arrived in Belgium as an asylum seeker, and he was looking for a job, and he applied for a job in a local music academy. And the people there said, well, you have to start the classes with the kids, you have to learn again do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si. And the guy was a professional musician appearing on TV in Iraq and so on. So this is not a way to repair the psychological damage of the refugee experience either. So the guy was saying, well, I can teach you all what music is about. He had many CDs. He is a very good artist. And so I think that, yeah, there's much more to say. There's another example which is more positive here is the project that's called Refugees for Refugees. It's actually a group of refugee musicians from different countries. They were put together in Brussels by NGO working in the field of music from different countries and so on. And they managed to rehearse together, to record the first CD together, to perform together, and they won an international award. Now they made their second CD, and I think they managed not only to solve some of the problems in their life, but also to give a positive image of refugees for in Belgium and European societies. So I could tell you many examples, but the question you raise is very deep, and yeah, I'm afraid we are not going in the right direction in terms of governance, of asylum, migration, and refugee in Europe. And that, again, to change, it takes not time, it takes mobilization, constant mobilization. And it's, of course, but we have to stick to it. Never give up, never give up.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, we have other questions from Martina Bedeschini Bucci. Hello, Marco. What do you think about the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of anti-racism? And in this sense, do you think that in the struggling formal forms and process, something is changing? If so, how? Thank you both.
Well, I answered a little bit before about, the Black Lives Matter. I think the movement is changing. And I think that, well, it's certainly in the US, it's different from the movement when it started in 2013. And I think that in Europe, I think that it should reach for more autonomy. That's what I was saying before, to invent an anti-racism that is appropriate to the European conditions. And when I say European conditions, it's the difference between what's going on in Finland and what's going on in Italy is already something. The histories are different and so on. But I think that, I think I sense a change. I think we are in an historic moment. I'm not saying that the movement is going to succeed or fail, but I think that now it's difficult, it's impossible to ignore the movement and the issues it puts forward, it puts on the agenda. And I do think that in order to change the power relations in a society, the first step is to put really an issue on the political agenda for a long period, not just as something that will pass rapidly. So it's maybe one first success, but what's going to happen, I'm not sure. I think that the coming weeks and months will be very important. My fear is that first, maybe in the US, but also in Europe, is that in order to stay in power, the president would be tempted to sort of fuel a kind of new civil war. We talk a lot about the police violence in the United States. We shouldn't forget the violence committed by citizens. George Floyd has a little bit occulted the young man who was killed in Georgia a few months ago by just doing his jogging. I don't remember the name of the 27 years old black guy. He was killed not by the police, he was killed by citizens. And so it seems to me that the messages sent by Trump is a kind of self-defense strategy for white people, all these militias and armed groups and so on. And this, in my view, is really a danger. And the antidote to that danger that could happen maybe in a different way in Europe is basically through alliances and convergence of struggles. And I think that the European people involved, many of them involved in the Black Lives Matter European versions, some of them understand that. As I said before, it's black and white anti-racists against black and white and others, and many others. All the people who are fed up with this racist society get back together with their own different standpoints, and in order to try to provoke these structural changes, and not only symbolic changes, which are always easy to produce, but in the end, not very satisfactory. We are done.
Thank you. Lorenza Ippolito.
You know, we have gone 6 minutes over the time. I don't know how it is with the.
Maybe we try to finish, because there are 3 or 4, maybe just few.
Okay.
For each, we try. Lorenza asks, I work with migrants in the UK, part of a poetry group. Language seems to both be a divider and a unified beyond nationality and ethnicity. Have you seen this in your work?
Yes, of course. That's why sometimes when there is a linguistic language problem, arts can fill the gap sometimes. Or one of my PhD students, she's an anthropologist, and she works with young refugees coming from different countries where there is the issue of linguistic diversity and understanding. And actually, the way they communicated was one of the ways was through a pottery workshop. They could share things, emotions, things by working together in pottery, making nice pots. But I think, it is, language remains a very important issue, not only in the field of migrants and refugee, but living in Belgium, where there are 3 national languages, where only a minority of the people speak the 3 national languages. I'm very sensitive to linguistic issues. But I also think that people, when they want to understand each other, they invent ways to communicate.
Okay, there are many comments, but about regarding question, Christina Huri asked about. She is a Jordanian living in Austria doing research, and her focus in how engaging in music activities achieves social integration of young refugees. And her question is about Arabs and discrimination between locals and refugees. And Jordan being a big host of refugees in the region, what do you call that type of racism? Please, Marco.
Well, again, that's I leave it to Christina to choose the label. I made this distinction between 4 dimensions of racism, but I think that racism. I think that any group can be racialized, actually, depending on the moment of history. Historians have shown that in the 19th century, Italians in America were not seen as whites. They were not seen as blacks. They were seen as non-whites, more leaning towards the blacks than the white. And in some regions of the US, the Italians were living with the blacks, actually, and doing the same jobs and so on. And so the same with the Irish in the industrial era. If you read even Friedrich Engels, because Marxism at the time was also touched by racialist theories that were, dominant at the time, the Irish were not considered to be white. So I think that's an important thing. Racialization can take different forms, but can affect different types of people. But historically, of course, there is the specificity of the Black experience I've talked about earlier. Maybe the most important thing to say is to look at this discrimination, and if they are based on the sources of the discrimination, and if you want to choose a label, choose the one that fits you most. But it's difficult for me, not knowing very well that region, to give you advice, I think. Sorry for that.
Maybe xenoracism, the racism
Yeah,
again.
as you said before, yeah.
Refugees. And Martina Ricciardi asked another question. I'd like to ask you, which kind of strategies do you imagine to make a profit of this transversality through arts? And another question about discrimination in the word art. She's an Italian living in France, and she confirms. Where is the question? Maybe just to share this view of discrimination in arts.
But anyway, all the participants, if you want to write to me, I will respond, because I understand that it's a bit short.
Okay.
My email is available everywhere, or on Facebook. So
Bakare Babatundalen asked the articles about arts and refugees.
Yeah, I can send that. Yeah, please write to me. The book is I can send it to you. It's open access, so I can send you the link.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Marco Martiniello, and thanks to all you listening to us all this time. And of course, thanks to Performing Resistance and Atlas of Transition Biennale.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Enjoy the other conferences, their talks.